Stangibelisco here, proprietor and operator of amateur radio station W1 GV Whiskey 1 Good Vibrations. In my previous video concerning possible plans for 2020, I mentioned the idea of a ladder line fed 80-meter dipole that would supposedly then operate on all bands, or pretty much all bands, except possibly certain frequencies on which the PAL-STAR antenna tuner at the transmitter end of the line saw an impedance it couldn't deal with, an exceedingly high impedance, or an exceedingly low impedance, or an impedance with an inordinate amount of reactance. There are just certain rogue frequencies with any such antenna that will present themselves. Most tuners have trouble with them. The PAL-STAR seems to tune just about anything. But one of the commenters for that video reported a problem with a very similar antenna. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what his it was actually cut for, what length the dipole was actually cut for. But everything was apparently done perfectly. According to theory, all of the setup was perfect, and yet there was radio frequency energy, RF, in the shack, causing havoc, of course, with equipment such as computers, and in the extreme case, if you run enough power, you can get RF burns off your equipment. And he said it doesn't seem to be any way to get rid of it. I had a similar problem back in the 1970s with a very similar antenna. The tuner was not a PAL-STAR, it was a Johnson Viking matchbox, which also has if you are lucky enough to own one of those old things, has a true balanced output, so that it is not cheating to get balance out of unbalance. It's the real deal. And I ran everything perfectly according to theory, and yet on 20 meters, I'm not sure if it was 20 meters, but there was a band on which I had one of my pieces of equipment just wouldn't work, and it indicated that it was RF in the shack. It was a HAL, Hotel Alpha Lima, the old HAL, I believe they were called HAL devices at that time, or HAL Communications in Urbana, Illinois. The model, which I still have down in my nerd cave, was the DKB 2010, Delta Kilo Bravo 2010 keyboard keyer. It had a 3-character memory, and the speed range that I had it set for was about 10 words a minute to 70 or 80 words a minute. But in any case, that thing just wouldn't behave itself. When I sent anything on that keyboard keyer on a certain band, I forget which one now, it would inject its own extra characters. And there's obviously RF in the shack, when all theory predicted that couldn't happen. Someone from quite a long time ago was commenting about theory versus practice. Asked me a question, is this theoretically true, or have you found it to be true in practice? Well, theoretically I shouldn't have had any RF in the shack, but in practice I did, and I never tried to get rid of it, so I can't offer any experience to tell you what to do, but I can offer some theory that might make a difference. Add or take away a few feet from each leg of your dipole antenna. Your dipole does not have to be resonant on any band when you feed it with ladder line. In fact, it may be best if it's not resonant on any band. The same is true of the feed line. If your feed line, considered as a single conductor, happens to have an electrical length equivalent to any integral multiple of a quarter wave length on any frequency. If it happens to, in other words, if it happens to be resonant for some reason, in and of itself, on any particular frequency, you are much more likely to have RF in the shack problems than you would be if it weren't. So the solution in that problem might be to add or take away just a few feet from the length of your transmission line. A third solution is to just not use 20 meters at all, or use an alternative antenna on 20 meters. I know that's kind of distasteful. It doesn't satisfy the desire to get rid of something. But sometimes you develop superbug bacteria, just as sometimes you develop superbugs in your ham radio equipment. They will resist all attempts, all antimicrobial or anti-RF measures that you can think of. It's not practical to use ferrite beads on ladder. Well, you might get large ferrite beads, large enough to wrap around both conductors of the ladder line and insulate them from both conductors and space them at intervals along the ladder line. You might try that. You might try twisting the ladder line. As I said, I think I said, take away or add a few feet of length to the ladder line. Or another alternative is, as I said, to use a different antenna. And probably the least appealing, but maybe the most interesting in the end, is to simply reduce your power until the RF in the shack doesn't cause any problems anymore. Run 3 watts and see what happens. See what kind of DX you can work on 20 meters with 3 watts. You're not likely to have RF in the shack then. I'm just offering suggestions that are theoretical because I've never tried any and I can't prove any exist. And I didn't try them back in the 1970s. I ended up moving away to Newington, Connecticut to work for W1AW, Whiskey 1 Alpha Whiskey, the Maxim Memorial Station at ARRL headquarters. So I didn't have time to find out, or didn't try to find out, what might solve that problem. Anyway, this is just my little take on what is probably one of the worst, most stubborn, and possibly quite common problems radio hams experience with any equipment. Stanja Belisco, W1GV, signing off, saying 73 and so long, which, RF in the shack or not? Well, maybe not if there is. If there isn't, it'll translate in my native fist to so long, da-da-da-da-da-da.